The Last Banner of Ashveil, Part 1. The disgraced, the headsman's axe never fell, because the kingdom that ordered it died first. Sir Keil Ashveil knelt in the mud of the execution yard, hands bound, listening to the screaming start somewhere beyond the castle walls. Not the screaming of a riot, but the high tearing screech of something with wings. He had exactly enough time to think that's not possible, before the world above him turned to fire. He didn't remember deciding to run. He remembered the rope at his wrists burning through against a dropped torch, the headsman already dead under a collapsed support beam, and then he was moving through smoke that smelled like a forge and a funeral at once. 3 days later, Keil was the last knight of a kingdom that no longer existed. Ashveil Keep, his home, his charge, the seat of the lord he'd been convicted of betraying, was a graveyard of scorched stone. The worm that burned it had come from the grey wastes to the north, a thing the old stories called a husk drake, a creature that hadn't been seen south of the mountains in 200 years. It hadn't come for treasure. It had come because the wards that kept it sleeping in the mountain had finally failed, and nobody alive remembered how they'd been built in the first place. Keil stood at the edge of the ruins with the only thing he'd carried out of his own execution, a length of broken chain still looped around one wrist, and the truth, useless now, that he'd never actually betrayed Lord Ashveil at all. The real traitor, Ashveil's own steward, a man named Voss, had framed him cleanly enough that even Keil had spent his last night believing he might actually deserve the axe. It didn't matter anymore. There was no lord left to clear his name. There was no kingdom left to care. What there was, scattered across the blackened fields below the keep, were survivors. 40 some of them, by his rough count. Farmers, a blacksmith with a crushed hand, 3 men-at-arms who'd fled the same fire he had, a girl no older than 12 who hadn't spoken since the attack, and one more thing, half buried near the collapsed chapel, a woman in scorched grey robes, alive, barely, with burns down one side of her face and a strange iron ring still smoking faintly on her finger. A mage, the last mage of Ashveil, who'd apparently tried to do something about the worm and very nearly died for it. Keil had been a knight his whole life and knew exactly one thing about magic. It was rare, it was dangerous, and the kingdoms that still had functioning mages tended to outlast the ones that didn't. He carried her out himself. Her name was Isolde, and she woke up 3 days later furious that she hadn't died doing something useful. The wards on the mountain were failing for years, she said, propped against a rock with her burned side wrapped in what passed for clean linen. I told the old lord. He told me wards were a problem for a wizard, not for a man with a treasury to manage, so he managed his treasury and now he's ash. You tried to refresh them yourself, Keil said. It wasn't a question. The smoking ring, the burns, the half-collapsed chapel, where she'd apparently been working, it all fit together easily enough for a man who'd spent a career reading battlefields. I tried. I'm a hedge mage who studied at a third-rate academy for 4 years before the money ran out. I am not strong enough to single-handedly hold back a ward built by people 3 centuries dead. I bought us maybe a season before that thing, or something, like it comes looking again. She looked at him properly for the first time, sharp, despite the pain. You're the knight they were going to execute. I am. For treason you didn't commit. It wasn't really a question either somehow. How do you know that? Because the men who actually planned treason don't carry survivors out of burning chapels on their backs while still wearing a hangman's rope. She closed her eyes. Congratulations, Sir Ashveil. You've inherited a kingdom of 43 farmers, a wounded mage, and roughly 1 season before the next monster wanders down out of the grey wastes to finish what the first one started. Keil looked out at the scattered survivors, people who, 3 days ago, hadn't been his responsibility in any way at all, and who now had absolutely nothing else. Then we'd better not waste the season, he said. Part 2. The foundation. The first thing Keil did wasn't build a wall. It was something Isolde insisted on before anything else, over his objections in a voice that left no room for the argument he tried to make. She needed time, materials, and absolute priority to begin re-anchoring even a fraction of the old mountain wards, because without that, nothing else they built would matter. A wall stops men, she said. It does not stop a husk drake. It does not stop whatever else slips through once the old boundary magic finishes failing. You can build the prettiest fortress in the realm, and it will be a very well-organized grave. So the first month went to her, gathering the specific stones she needed from the chapel ruins, the iron that had survived the fire, and an uncomfortable amount of Cale's own blood, given freely once, for a binding she refused to fully explain except to say, Knight's Oath blood holds wards better than peasant blood. It's an old quirk of the old magic, don't ask me why. Ask the people who built it 300 years ago. Oh, wait. What she built wasn't a fortress. It was a renewed boundary line around roughly 2 miles of Scorch Valley. Not impenetrable, she was clear about that, but enough to make the area actively unattractive to anything sniffing around for easy prey, the magical equivalent of a beware of dog sign with actual teeth behind it. While she worked, Cale did the only other thing he knew. He organized survivors who had never once been organized in their lives. The blacksmith, a broad, taciturn man named Boris, had a crushed hand that would never properly swing a hammer again, but he could still direct others, and Cale put him in charge of salvaging every scrap of metal from the ruined keep, instead of letting it rust into the mud. The 3 men-at-arms, none of them particularly skilled, became the seed of something Cale refused to call an army yet, because calling 43 traumatized survivors an army would have been a cruel joke. He called it a watch instead, and it sounded smaller, and that was the point. The girl who hadn't spoken, her name, they eventually learned from one of the farmers, was Thessaly, turned out to have a memory for the old keep's layout sharper than anyone else's. She drew, when she still wouldn't talk, a rough map of the underground stores beneath the collapsed armory that nobody else had remembered existed. Cale found grain down there, not much, but more than they had. By the time Isolde finished the first ward line, exhausted and pale and missing 2 fingernails to a backlash she waved off as the magic's way of saying thank you, the camp had become something with edges to it, a perimeter. Stores that weren't simply sitting in the open, a handful of people who knew which job was theirs instead of 43 people waiting to be told what to do by whoever shouted loudest. It wasn't a kingdom. It was the absence of total chaos, which, Cale was learning fast, was most of what a kingdom actually was in its first months. The man who shouted loudest, as it turned out, was a former Ashveil man-at-arms named Reth, bigger than Cale, louder than Cale, and deeply unhappy that a disgraced traitor knight was the one giving orders. He was convicted, Reth said to anyone who'd listen, usually within Cale's hearing, which Cale suspected was the point. Convicted by Lord Ashveil himself. You're all taking orders from a man the old lord wanted dead. The old lord is dead, Boric said flatly, not looking up from the scrap pile he was sorting. His judgment doesn't carry much weight from a grave. And what, you trust this one's judgment instead? Because he's been kind enough to give us jobs. I trust that he carried a burned mage out of a collapsing chapel instead of running for the hills alone, Boric said. And I trust that we've eaten better in 2 weeks under his nonsense than we did the 2 weeks before that when nobody had any nonsense at all and we were all just standing in a field hoping the next monster skipped us. Reth didn't have an answer for that, which only made him angrier. Cale, for his part, didn't fight the man over it directly. He'd learned enough about leadership during his years as a knight to know that arguing with a man like Reth in front of a crowd just handed Reth a stage. Instead, he gave Reth something to actually do, command of the watch's drilling, the one task that let a loud, physically capable, deeply insecure man feel important without putting him anywhere near actual decisions. It worked, mostly, for a while. Reth liked being in charge of something. He was good, in fact, at making frightened farmers swing a spear with something resembling discipline. The resentment didn't disappear. It just stopped being the most urgent problem in camp, which was the best Cale could realistically hope for from a man like that this early. The actually urgent problem arrived in the 3rd month in the form of refugees. Word had spread, the way word always did even across a burned and broken land. There was a valley near the old Ashveil ruins that hadn't been raided, hadn't burned, and had a mage who'd apparently put up some kind of ward that made the local monsters think twice. 43 people became 70. 70 became just over 100 within 2 months, as survivors from 3 other burned holdings trickled in. Farmers, a handful of actual soldiers from a lord's broken household guard, an old woman who turned out to know more about herbcraft and healing than anyone else in the camp combined, and most usefully, 2 more people with the faint, frayed talent for magic that Isolde recognized immediately and pulled aside before anyone else even noticed they were unusual. They're not trained, Isolde told Cale privately, but talent's talent. Give me a season and I'll have 3 hedge mages instead of one half-burned idiot. Give me a year and we might actually be able to maintain the full mountain ward instead of the patch I slapped together out of desperation and, your blood. And if something comes before the year's up, then we die slightly more competently than we would have otherwise, Isolde said. I'm a mage, Cale, not a miracle. The first real test came not from a monster, but from men, which Cale had quietly expected long before it happened, because a valley with food, water, and growing safety was exactly the kind of thing that drew predators with 2 legs, as readily as it drew ones with wings. A warband calling itself the Ashclaws, deserters and broken men from a dozen fallen households banded together under a former mercenary captain named Drask, arrived at the edge of the valley in the 4th month, 60 strong, with the kind of confidence that came from having successfully looted 3 other settlements already that season. Drask sent no terms. He sent a burning arrow into the nearest field as an opening statement, and Cale understood the message well enough. Give us what you have, or we take it after burning the rest. 120 people, most of them farmers, most of them already traumatized survivors of exactly this kind of violence once already, against 60 hardened raiders. By every honest count, it should have been a massacre. Cale had 3 things Drask didn't, and he used all of them. The first was the ward line itself, not strong enough to stop men outright, but strong enough, Isolde confirmed grimly, to make anyone crossing it feel a deep, bone-level unease. The longer they lingered inside it, the kind of low magical pressure that frayed nerves and slowed reactions, without anyone quite understanding why. Drask's men didn't know that. They just knew the valley felt wrong in a way none of them could name, and wrong was exactly the kind of thing that made disciplined raiders sloppy. The second was terrain Cale had spent 4 months learning intimately, the same way he'd once learned Every Wall and Gate of Ashveil Keep before that. He didn't meet Drask's warband in the open field they expected. He drew them instead through the narrow, burned-out lane, between the old keep's collapsed outer walls, rubble on both sides, a single approach, no room for 60 men to spread into the kind of overwhelming line that wins battles through sheer numbers. The third was Reth, finally given the moment his pride had been straining toward for 4 months, command of the Watch's spear line, holding that narrow approach with 30 drilled farmers and 3 actual soldiers behind a barricade of salvaged rubble and sharpened stakes, while Cale himself led a smaller group around the flank, through ground only Thessaly's memory of the old tunnels beneath the armory made possible. The battle wasn't clean. Cale lost 6 people that day, 4 farmers turned spearmen and 2 of the original men-at-arms, and he made himself say each of their names aloud at the fire that night, the way he intended to do for every loss from then on, because a leader who stopped counting the cost of being right was a leader who'd stopped deserving to lead. But Drask's confident 60 broke against 30 disciplined defenders, and a flank attack they never saw coming until it was already inside their formation. And Drask himself died on Cale's own blade in the rubble lane. Not from any particular skill, Cale admitted privately to Isolde afterward, but because the man had simply never imagined a burned-out ruin full of farmers could actually fight back with anything resembling a plan. The survivors of the Ashclaws, maybe 20 men, disarmed and broken, knelt in the mud the next morning expecting execution. Cale didn't give it to them. You can leave, he said, or you can work. We need hands more than we need corpses, and I'd rather a man earn his bread honestly than die for a captain who's already dead and never cared if you lived or died either. Half of them left. The other half stayed, and within a season, nobody in the valley remembered or cared which of the Watch had once worn an Ashclaw's colours. Reth, for his part, never quite forgave Cale for the leadership, but he stopped openly questioning it. A man who'd held a line and watched the strategy work from the inside had a hard time pretending the strategy didn't exist. Part 3. The Kingdom. A year after the Wyrm burned Ashveil Keep to ash, the valley had a name people used without irony. Last Hold. Not a kingdom yet, not in any title that mattered, but something that had stopped being merely a camp of survivors and started being a place people chose, deliberately, to come to. 300 and some people now. A proper palisade replacing the rubble barricades. Fields planted in soil that had been ash a year before. A forge under Boric's direction turning out tools faster than weapons because Cale had learned, watching the camp's first year unfold, That a community that could feed and equip itself needed far fewer weapons than one that couldn't. Isolde's small order of mages, four now, counting herself with two more showing faint promise under careful and patient teaching, had finished. The patchwork ward Kale's blood had helped seed in those first desperate weeks, replacing it slowly with something closer to the old mountain boundary's original strength. Not perfect. Isolde was relentlessly honest about that, refusing every chance to let people believe the valley was now simply safe, but strong enough that nothing smaller than the original husk drake itself had any easy reason to test it. Which leaves, she told Kale over a council table that had once been a chapel altar, exactly one problem we haven't solved, the thing that started all of this. The worm. It hadn't returned, but word had reached them through traders willing to risk the northern roads. It had been seen twice more, once near a ruined border fort, once circling the high passes of the Grey Wastes themselves, restless and hungry in a way that suggested the mountain that had slept it for 2 centuries was no longer doing its job at all. It's not a question of if it comes back, Isolde said. It's a question of when, and whether we're ready when it does. Kale had spent a year building a place worth defending. He understood, with the particular clarity of a man who'd already watched one home burn once, that none of it mattered if he couldn't answer the actual threat that had created this place to begin with. Then we stop waiting for it, he said. We go find out what's actually happening at that mountain, and we fix the original ward properly, instead of patching the edges of the problem forever. The expedition north took 11 people: Kale, Isolde, 2 of her newer mages, Reth, and 4 of the Watch's best fighters, Boric, insistent that someone who understood old metalwork needed to see whatever ancient wardstones they found, since the original boundary magic, Isolde explained, had apparently been anchored partly in worked iron rather than pure spellcraft, and Thessaly, 16 now, who'd finally started speaking again over the past year, and who refused point blank to be left behind from the one journey that might explain why her home had burned in the first place. The Grey Waste lived up to their name: grey ash fields, grey stone, a grey sky that never seemed to fully clear even at midday. The kind of land that had clearly once supported something far grander than the scattered ruin markers that were all that remained of whatever civilization had built the original wards. They found the anchor point on the 9th day, a half-collapsed tower built into the mountain's shoulder itself, its base ringed with iron sigils so old they'd nearly rusted into the stone they were set in. Exactly the kind of structure Isolde had described from half-remembered academy text, but never actually expected to see standing, however barely, after 3 centuries of neglect. It's not failing because it's old, Isolde said, kneeling at the base of the tower, tracing one degraded sigil with careful fingers. It's failing because half these iron anchors have actually been pulled or broken. This wasn't decay. Someone did this. Recently, by the look of the breaks. It was Boric, examining the scattered metal with a blacksmith's practical eye, rather than a mage's theoretical one, who found the answer nobody wanted. Tool marks. Pry marks, the unmistakable signature of someone who'd come to this tower deliberately and methodically, stripped working iron sigils for their metal value, almost certainly without any idea, or any care, what those sigils actually held back. Scavengers, Boric said grimly. Someone's been picking this place apart for scrap iron, the same way I'd pick apart any old ruin, except this ruin happened to be the only thing keeping that drake asleep. The drake itself found them before they finished the repair. It came down out of the low grey clouds without the dramatic roar Kale had half expected from old stories. Just a sudden, vast shadow, and a wash of heat that scorched the ground 20 feet from where Thessaly stood, close enough that Reth threw himself bodily into her, knocking them both clear, a half-second before the next breath of flame would have caught her directly. The husk drake was smaller than Ashveil Keep's burned ruins had led Kale to imagine, though smaller still meant something the length of 3 wagons end to end, scaled hide the colour of old bone, eyes a pale, sickly yellow that tracked the scattered party, with the slow, deliberate hunger of something that hadn't properly fed in longer than it liked. Kale had exactly one advantage in the fight that followed, and it wasn't strength, because no amount of strength mattered against something that size. It was the same advantage he'd used against Drask's warband a year before. Terrain and the people around him who'd learned, over a year of building something together, to trust a plan even when the plan looked like madness in the moment. The anchor stones, Cale shouted to Isolde over the roar of a second flame breath scorching the rocks, where his fighters had been standing a heartbeat before. Can you finish the repair now, mid-fight, or does it need to be done clean? It needs blood and focus, not silence. Isolde was already moving toward the half-repaired tower base, her two younger mages flanking her, hands already glowing with the strained, desperate light of spellwork, pushed faster than it wanted to go. Buy me time, Cale, that's the entire plan. So Cale bought time the only way he knew how. Not by fighting the Drake head-on, an idea so suicidal he didn't dignify it with consideration, but by using the same broken tower ruins around them as the same kind of choke point terrain he'd used against Drask's men, forcing the creature to either squeeze through narrow collapsed passages, where its wings and bulk worked against it, or stay in the open where Reth's spear line, 4 fighters deep, could at least force it to keep its distance, instead of closing for the kill. It wasn't winning. Cale knew that with total clarity, even as he shouted the watch into formation, watched 2 more scorching near misses turn ancient rubble to glass, felt the heat of a breath that came close enough to singe his own eyebrows. It was surviving, second by second, buying exactly the kind of time Isolde had asked for and nothing more. Thessaly was the one who saw it first, the Drake's pattern, the same kind of repeating tell that Cale himself might have spotted a season earlier, if he hadn't been entirely consumed with simply staying alive. Every third breath of flame came slower, dragged, the creature's flank visibly heaving with the effort. It's not endless, she shouted, voice cracking but clear over the chaos. Count to 3. It has to breathe before the next one. It's tired. It was such a small thing. A girl who'd spent a year rebuilding her own voice after watching her home burn, finding exactly the right moment to use it. Cale adjusted the line on her word alone, trusting a 16-year-old's battlefield instinct in a way he wouldn't have trusted his own a year before, and the watch held a half-second longer on every third breath than instinct alone would have told them to, buying just enough margin that nobody else burned. It was margin enough. Isolde's voice rose behind them in something that wasn't quite words, the old binding tongue of magic 3 centuries dead being spoken again at the base of a half-repaired tower, blood from a willing cut across her own palm. Not Cale's this time, her choice and hers alone, sealing into iron seagulls that hadn't held proper, power in longer than anyone alive could remember. The war didn't kill the Drake. Isolde had been honest about that from the very start. It was never a weapon, only a boundary, the same kind of magic that had kept the creature dormant for 2 centuries before some careless scavenger had pried it loose for scrap. But a boundary renewed mid-battle, anchored in fresh blood and desperate focus, was apparently enough to do what it had always been built to do. The Drake's next breath came slower, its movements suddenly sluggish, pale yellow eyes clouding with the same drugged, drowsy weight that had presumably kept it sleeping inside that mountain for 200 years before anyone had ever disturbed it. It didn't die. It simply, finally, stopped, folding down into the broken rubble of its own collapsing tower prison, the fight draining out of it as the old ward reasserted exactly the function it had always been meant to serve. Cale lowered his blade, breathing hard, watching the great, bone-pale shape settle into something that looked for all the world like sleep. Is that it? Reth asked, hoarse, lowering his spear with visible disbelief. It's just done? It's contained, Isolde said, swaying on her feet, her younger mages catching her before she fell. Same as it was for 200 years before some idiot with a crowbar decided rusty old iron looked valuable. We didn't kill a legend today, we just put it back to sleep, properly, this time, and made sure nobody can pull it loose again without serious effort. It wasn't the ending out of an old knight's tale. There was no slain dragon, no triumphant horn call, no glory to carry home and sing about at feasts. There was only a tired, bloodied group of 11 people, standing in the grey ash of a mountain that had nearly killed all of them, having fixed, not conquered, fixed, the actual root of the disaster that had started everything a year before. Cale decided, looking at his exhausted, living companions, that he could live with an ending like that. Part 4. Last Hold. They built proper guard markers around the tower before they left. Not enough magic among them to make the boundary unbreakable. Isolde was clear about that, but enough warning signs, both mundane and arcane, that no future scavenger could claim ignorance the way the last one apparently had. Cale left two of the watch's most reliable men stationed at the base on a rotating watch. The first standing garrison of what would, within another year, become a proper way station manned by people from 3 different settlements who'd all learned the hard way exactly what happened when nobody minded the mountain. The journey back to Last Hold took 10 days, and Cale spent most of them in the strange, settled quiet of a man who'd finally closed a wound he hadn't fully realized he was still carrying. Not just the worm, but the entire year since his own execution had been interrupted by fire. He'd spent that year building, because building was the only thing that had made sense in the face of total loss. He hadn't quite let himself believe, until the mountain quieted behind them, that the building had actually amounted to something real. Last Hold hadn't burned in their absence. Of course, it hadn't, that was rather the point of everything they'd spent a year doing. But there was something in seeing the palisade gates still standing, the field still tended, the forge smoke still rising, that hit Cale harder than he expected after 11 days of fearing quietly that he'd returned to find it all undone. The council that met him at the gate wasn't a formal one. It had never been formal. Last Hold didn't have crowns or thrones or any of the trappings Cale had spent his whole prior life serving under at Ashveil Keep. It was Boric and the old healer woman whose name Cale had learned was Maren, and Reth, and a dozen others who'd simply become, over the course of a year, the people whose judgment the rest of the valley trusted. "We've had 3 more groups of refugees arrive while you were gone," Boric said, without preamble, the way Boric said most things. "Word's spreading faster than I'd like. People are calling this place a kingdom, whether we've decided to call it one ourselves or not." "It's not a kingdom," Cale said, more out of habit than conviction at this point. "It's a valley full of people trying to survive the same disaster, same as it's been from the start." "It's been a year, Sir Ashveil." Maren's voice was gentle but entirely unyielding, the same tone she used on patients who needed to hear an unwelcome truth. "You've got laws now, even if nobody's written them down properly. You've got a watch, a treasury of sorts, fields that feed 300 people, and a council that argues with you in public and still does what you ask in the end, because we trust you've usually thought it through. Call it whatever modest word makes you comfortable. It stopped being merely a camp some time ago." Cale looked out over Last Hold, the rebuilt palisade, the fields green where Ash had been, Thessaly already surrounded by a knot of younger children, eager to hear what the mountain had actually looked like, Isolde being half carried toward Maren's care by her own apprentices, exhausted but alive, having repaired in a single desperate hour what 3 centuries of neglect had broken. He thought of Ashveil Keep and the lord who'd convicted him on a steward's lie rather than question it properly, and the kingdom that had burned because nobody with the power to fix a failing ward had ever bothered to take the warning seriously. "Then we do it properly this time," Cale said finally. "Not a crown, not a throne, just rules, written down where everyone can see them, and a council that actually has the power to tell me I'm wrong, because the last lord I served never let anyone tell him that, and look what it cost him. It wasn't the kind of declaration that belonged in old ballads. There was no coronation, no grand title, no moment of triumphant music. There was simply a disgraced knight a year removed from his own execution, standing at the gate of something he'd built without ever quite meaning to build a kingdom, choosing, deliberately, with eyes open to exactly how, the last kingdom had failed, to build this one differently. 5 years on, Last Hold had a name people used on actual maps, the Hold of Ashveil, not in memory of the lord who'd nearly let it burn through neglect, but in memory of the keep itself and the idea that something could rise from ash and choose, this time, not to repeat the mistakes buried in that ash. Cale never took a crown. He kept the title he'd always actually held. Sir, Knight, nothing grander, even as the council around him grew from a dozen trusted voices into something that functioned, in practice if never in name, like the first real parliament the region had seen in living memory. Boric ran what had become a proper guild of smiths and craftsmen. Reth commanded a standing watch 300 strong, fully reconciled at last to a leadership he'd once resented, because 5 years of watching that leadership actually work had finally worn down the last of his old grudge. Thessaly, 17 now and apprenticed fully to Isolde, had become the Hold's second mage of real note, the girl who hadn't spoken for a year now, lecturing visiting scholars on ward theory with a confidence nobody who'd known her in those first burned weeks could quite believe. Isolde herself, scarred but thriving, led an order of mages numbering 9 now, with a standing agreement, Cale's idea, born from watching one lord's negligence nearly doom an entire kingdom, that no ward anywhere in whole territory would ever again be left to fail simply because checking on it wasn't anyone's official responsibility. She visited the mountain tower twice a year herself without fail, and made certain everyone training under her understood exactly why that mattered. The worm slept on, properly contained, a quiet monument at the edge of the map to the cost of carelessness and the deliberate, unglamorous work of fixing it. Standing once more on the ridge above Last Hold, on a clear evening, 5 years after fire had taken everything he'd once called home, Cale Ashveil looked down at fields and forges and a wall that had never been breached since the day Drask's Warben broke against it, and thought, not for the first time, that the kingdom he'd actually wanted to build had never needed a throne at all. It had only ever needed people willing to do the work, and a leader willing to let them tell him when he was wrong. He turned from the ridge and went down to join them, because there was always more work, and for the first time in 5 years, that thought didn't feel like a burden at all. The end.